Yes. It's a key question. Unfortunately, it doesn't get enough, I guess, emphasis here in domestic American politics, as more what we would call kitchen table issues like taxes and inflation tend to take the lead. I think it's probably best to break it down as to the stark choice between a Trump administration versus a Harris administration vis-a-vis relations with Russia, then another category with Iran, and then, of course, the most important with China. And I think on the issue with China, you're going to see the less of a real meaningful difference. There's been a consensus in DC now for well over the last 7 or 8 years that views China as an adversary, and that economic as well as diplomatic and military improvement of our position needs to be invested in. So I don't think on China much will change in a meaningful way. I think when it comes to Iran and the Middle East, I think you could not find a more stark difference between a Trump, which would be very clear-eyed, and a more speak softly and carry a big stick kind of mentality, versus a Kamala Harris, which has tried through diplomacy and through inducements to bring the mullahs in Tehran into a favorable or a détente type of relationship with the United States. And that has
Yes.
not worked for the last few years.
Yeah. Well, what about Russia? Because I know that the perspective of both candidates is quite different when it comes to dealing with Russia. How do you see this being handled if either one wins?
Well, the first thing is I think most of the media here in the United States is mischaracterizing, again, playing to a domestic political audience, what a return of President Trump would be. And looking at his track record with Russia, I think Russia would be in store for a much more forceful position, despite the rhetoric from a President Trump. Uh, Whether or not it means open-ended provision of munitions and weapon to Ukraine, set that aside. I could see early on in the Trump administration a much more forceful, allowing Ukraine full use of the weapons that it's been given to bring the war to a rapid conclusion, but more likely to get to a stance. Both sides would be compelled to a negotiated solution that actually meets American national interest.
Okay.
The Kamala Biden administration, unfortunately, has really not laid out a strategy, and so we're in more of a tension otherwise.
Okay, well, since you talked about the idea that foreign policy in general is not something that is focused on necessarily when it comes to the American public, but in light of the heightened security concerns surrounding foreign influence when it comes to the 2024 elections, how can the Pentagon and other US agencies ensure that national security remains uncompromised when it comes to the elections, and no one can claim, that there was some sort of, something happening when it comes to the electoral process where one party or the other says that it was unfair?
No, absolutely. Again, the American public is very skeptical, given the last, I guess, 8 years of recent history, but certainly since the COVID epidemic and the suppression of information under the guise of it being claimed as misinformation. Some of it, of course, foreign influence, even in this current election, which we know Iranian sources as well as Russian sources, and one not mentioned enough, Chinese influence as well, has all been at play. It has to be very transparent what the government does in exposing and going after foreign influences, not dependent on what side of the political spectrum that it favors. And unfortunately, the track record's not very clear on that. But we'll see in the day after tomorrow when we wake up and we start hearing the lawyers getting engaged as to which elections or which districts had suspect activities, and how the government and the agencies respond in a nonpartisan way. That is actually going to be the proof that the election system is being adhered to in a nonpartisan and in a principled manner.
So, in your view, what role should the intelligence services and the Pentagon play when it comes to protecting the integrity of the US elections, and how can the military actually be effectively used to address the growing threats rather to foreign influence in the US electoral process? Is it the military, or is it, cybersecurity, for instance?
Well, first, let me take the most dangerous in American history, going back to our Revolutionary War and then reiterated again during our Civil War in the mid 1800s. The military is prohibited from playing a role in the domestic politics, and it would be very dangerous for even military intelligence agencies to play an active role in going out after information or misinformation associated with the campaigns. Better and the more appropriate agency would be the FBI, working hand in hand with the CIA to track down and to blunt any foreign influences that are at play right now in the United States.
Okay, so will the focus be on cybersecurity, or is there other actionable plans on the ground, for instance, when it comes to protecting the integrity of the process?
Well, it's comprehensive. I mean, the cyber is only one part of this. Things like social media, bots are at the low end of it, to actual influence information campaigns to try to sway particular decision makers, perhaps say the lead chief of police for Capitol Police and security around Capitol Hill. So it goes from a more general, low-level kind of information to a very targeted. And that's where the FBI, CISA, which is another agency to go after the cyber aspects of this, are designed and should be actively engaged. We know they have been because of testimony before the Hill, specifically about Iranian hands behind many of the campus protests in support of Hamas in the recent few months.
Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily, address the U.S. elections itself. But I mean, since you've brought up the idea of disinformation, the U.S. intelligence community is warned about, foreign disinformation campaigns, especially, as you've said, from Iran, in addition to Russia, aimed at undermining the trust in the election process. What role could the U.S. intelligence services play when it comes to this, and how can you help make the American public aware of this sort of disinformation so that they are not, sucked into the idea of this information?
Well, first and foremost is not to try to restrict Americans' access to information, good, bad, or indifferent. The agencies should be on the lookout for nefarious illegal activities, no matter where it comes from. But the worst thing that could happen is for the federal government to start to dictate or determine what information is good and what information is bad. That is censorship, and it actually undermines one of the core principles of American freedom and democracy. It's one of our civil rights that would be undermined. So we have to be very careful against that.
Well, I mean, yes, it's understandable what you're saying, but in a world where information is so easily available, there's so much of it, it's very hard to distinguish between what's real and what's not. What would you, tell the average American to do when it comes to digesting this sort of information?
So from my experience living both in and outside of the United States and having some familiarity with multiple languages, is that the truth is usually in between your mainstream sources in Democrat and Republican storylines. And so get your news and force yourself to get your news from multiple sites, even news sources that you don't really find very appealing, but try to challenge your own assumptions, have critical questioning attitude, and find and search for the truth. Don't search for news that just reevaluates or reassesses what you already know or what you're predisposed to believe in. It's a tall bill for most Americans and most people who are busy, but that's really the best advice that I've been giving for pretty much 20 years, the advent of social media and the popularity of a lot of this information-based, remote-based news sources.